246. Art, Christian and Non-Christian. Chalcedon Report number 368, March 1996. Art does not become Christian because its subject becomes, for example, paintings of biblical themes. Our faith, like our language, is the expression of our total lives. If English is our native tongue, we speak it naturally, whether or not we are awake or talking in our sleep. It is our native tongue, and we best express ourselves in it. To illustrate, Matisse, when working on the chapel, once said to a nun, "I'm doing it for myself." She said, "But you told me you were doing it for God." Matisse answered, "Yes, but I am God." Janet Hobhouse, The Bride Stripped Bare, New York, New York, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, 1988, page 102. Matisse was honest about his art. As his own God, he was a creator more than a painter, and his importance is in part due to the self-conscious nature of his art. Art develops in terms of its presuppositions. It becomes epistemologically self-conscious, more and more aware of the premises that underlie its conception. Art is a perspective on life. When John Milton wrote Paradise Lost, for example, or Samson Agonistes, he was intensely concerned with understanding the collapse of the Puritan Commonwealth and his own blindness from a biblical perspective. His was a theological attempt to understand the events of his lifetime. Whether or not his effort was theologically sound does not alter the Christian framework and motivation. Quite the opposite is Ezra Pound's Cantos. Pound, like Matisse, does not seek to understand history, but rather to remake or create it. He writes largely in English, but not in the English that Christians can readily grasp. Thus, art, Christian and non-Christian, begins and ends with differing views of the artist and his art. The artist in the non- or anti-Christian begins and ends with differing views of the artist and his art. The artist in the non- or anti-Christian perspective is not only a creator, but he is in the process of creating himself. He will not be someone made in the image of God, but, quote, must, end quote, be someone who has undertaken the agonizing task of creating himself. In my student days, I found that more than a few professors correlated psychological pathologies with artistic achievement. I briefly knew a talented young artist who believed that he needed every kind of experimentation, beginning with sex and drugs, to attain artistic stature. He died as a result of his experimental living. Such thinking is now commonplace. Joel Conneroe, editor of 8 American Poets, 1994, sees derangement of the senses as necessary to the artist. The Romantics glorified madness. Conneroe's poets accept it as a price paid for creativity. He asks, was it inevitable that the Holocaust and Hiroshima, central horrors of the age, should become metaphors for a poet's inner torments and sense of guilt? Joel Conneroe, editor, 8 American Poets, New York, New York, Random House, 1994, page 20. Now, this is a remarkable statement. First, the poet's inner torments and sense of guilt are compared to the Holocaust in Hiroshima. Guilt over what? From the Christian perspective, all men are sinners and carry a burden of sin and guilt until they find atonement in Christ. The alternative to Christ's atonement is sadomasochism. With masochism, the man of guilt endlessly punishes himself to make atonement. With sadism, he punishes others and makes them his sin-bearers. What Conneroe describes means that art now requires a pathological condition in the true artist. Conneroe cites the sculptor Auguste Saint-Gaudens, who said, "What garlic is to salad, insanity is to art." Ibid, page 21. Some writers seem to revel in their chosen isolation. Robert Lowell, 1917 to 1977, was called Cal in school for Caliban, although he preferred Caligula. Ibid, page 68. John Berryman, 1914 to 1972, said in one poem, "I'm cross with God who has wrecked this generation." Ibid, page 150. For some, astrology is part of their rejection of God's reality. For more than a few, it is homosexuality. Homosexuality means a shorter life expectancy and exposure to more diseases than is the case with heterosexuals. Since the onset of AIDS, and the penchant of many to wear it as a badge of honour as against an indifferent and hostile world, one at times gets the impression that, if AIDS did not exist, the homosexuals would work to invent it. There is another aspect to non-Christian art. Turning from the avant-garde to the mainstream artists, we find some interesting trends in some prominent figures. Two examples of one facet can be seen in the very able 20th century artists, Edward Hopper and Andrew Wyeth. A startling aspect of their world is a strong sense of isolation. Wyeth strips a scene of a variety of things to give us not only a concentrated view, but also a sense of the isolation of persons and things. The result is a very lonely world and a bleak one. His paintings belong in galleries or in extremely modern homes and offices where life is depersonalized. Edward Hopper, 1882 to 1967, was even more given to this bleakness. In urban scenes, the streets are deserted, restaurants virtually empty, and his figures of men and women show us people radically alone in a depopulated world. It is almost as if a giant vacuum cleaner has sucked up most people and things. What remains is a world without speech and communication, empty of meaning and empty of human relationships. The viewer becomes a spectator to a nearly empty world, and he is an outsider to it. The world of Hopper is fully familiar in its images, but it is eerily empty of life and action. Hopper's world is full of models and settings, but barren of life. When Hopper visited New Mexico, its beauty dazzled him, but left him ill at ease and unable to paint. After days of search, he finally found what suited him, an abandoned locomotive. Donald Hall and Pat Carrington Wykes, Anecdotes of Modern Art, New York, New York, Oxford University Press, 1990, page 145. To forsake God is to forsake meaning and standards, but the descent into the abyss does not occur at once, except in a few individuals. Culturally, the Western world went from God and his law word to nature and natural law. After Darwin, nature was replaced by the state or the anarchic individual, or by various causes. For example, feminism has become for many a paradigm, and a work such as Lyndon Lauchlin's The Politics of Vision, 1989, is at times perceptive, but still severely limited. Limited causes, whether or not valid, cannot give meaning to a cosmic void. And this is the problem. When man abandons faith in God, he abandons meaning. Dostoevsky was right. If there is no God, then all things are possible. An overall binding meaning and law have been abandoned, and we are in a totally meaningless world, the world of the Marquis de Sade. Justice is then impossible, because there is no God, and evil becomes man's expression, the manifestation of his freedom from God. Robert Rauschenberg, born 1925, saw this clearly. The only meaning without God is self-created and self-ordained. In a telegram to Iris Clert, an art dealer in Paris, he said simply, "The telegram is a work of art if I say it is." Halls and Wykes, Anecdotes, page 348. Precisely. And this is the problem of modern man, which artists face more clearly. This perhaps makes their mental problems and suicides more explicable. René Magritte, 1889 to 1967, saw no reason for living or dying. Ibid, page 260. Stanley Spencer said, "In my painting, I owe nothing to God and everything to the devil." Ibid, pages 240 and 241. Willem de Koning, born 1904, left quickly after glancing at Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, saying, "You know, I'm no art lover." Ibid, page 310. Alberto Giacometti's 1901 to 1966 waking dreams were happy dreams of rape. Ibid, page 275. Roberto Matta, born 1911, saw fatherhood as a form of half-castration. Ibid, page 310. And why not? Responsibility is a step back into God's world. Artists have, in our time, been much given to irresponsible acts, whether drunk or sober. There is a well-known incident when Jackson Pollock, 1912 to 1956, walked naked into a party and urinated in the fireplace. Ibid, page 327. Quite rightly, John Cage has been described as chance's apostle. Ibid, page 345. Chance, meaninglessness, and emptiness are the heart of contemporary art's gospel. Art reformers like Leo Tolstoy have failed over the generations because their concern is moralistic and not theological. Art is a theological exercise and a form of communication. The hostility of the modern artist to communication is intense. His attitude is, choose your own meaning. He rejects any overall meaning in art or in life, whereas for the theologically astute Christian, we live in a universe of total meaning, so that man can never escape meaning in any way. Francis Thompson's poem, The Hound of Heaven, very ably sets forth this cosmic and total scope of meaning, the personal meaning of the personal and triune God. If the Christian artist seeks to limit meaning to a moral content, he is reducing the implications of the faith to the human realm. A faithful, theological expression will be inclusive of the ethical and aesthetic, among other things. Without this Christian theological content, art drifts into passion for the disconnected and the isolated. It drifts into a man-centered focus. It begins, for example, with romantic love. Then it stresses dirty love, whether heterosexual or homosexual. The homosexual plays a major part in contemporary art because his stress is so anti-Christian. Random observations replace meaning in poetry. When man is not governed by God and his realm of total meaning, he substitutes purely personal impulses and demands for God's law. The men of Sodom, Genesis 19 verse 5, and the men of Gibeah, Judges 19 verse 22, demanded as a right the freedom to sodomize strangers. The, quote, death of God, end quote, in a culture leads steadily to the death of man because it destroys God's justice in denying his law. Man then is, as set forth by the Marquis de Sade, simply something to be used, abused, sodomized, raped, and killed by those who can do it. Anti-Christianity, in due time, is the death of art and man. No one has answered Robert Rauschenberg's telegram. This telegram is a work of art if I say it is. Meaning is gone, and art and life with it.